Good afternoon. My name is Bill Martin. I have the privilege to direct the Religion and Public Policy here at the Baker Institute, and we are happy to join together today with the Texas Freedom Network Education Fund, with Kathy Miller and Ryan Valentine here on the front row. And why don't you go ahead and stand up? You're full partners here. Also with the Rice Religion and Public Life program, which is headed by my colleague Elaine Eklund of the Sociology Department. We commend you for coming, for making it today. Others may be coming in, others may have been more prudent. But in any case, when Ryan Valentine and I talked about this about a year ago today about this program, we thought it was a great idea, and we wanted to be sure to set this program in January so it would come before all of the primaries. That, of course, was before pent-up Republican excitement resulted in premature electionation. Fortunately for us, not everything has been settled and may not be for some time. I want to introduce the speakers to you on this particular panel now, but I'm only going to do that briefly. I'm going to ask you to depend mainly on the printed material in your program. I'm confident that all of you read at least grade level, some even better. In my case, I'm only 74, but I read at a 78-year-old level. Our first speaker this afternoon, our first panelist, is John Green. The Los Angeles Times described John Green as the nation's preeminent student of the relationship between religion and American politics. We really appreciate preeminence here at the Baker Institute, so we're happy John is with us. As your program notes, he has responsibilities as director of the Ray C. Bliss Institute of Applied Politics at the University of Akron and as a senior research advisor to the Pew Research Center's Forum on Religion and Public Life. In seasons such as ours, John Green is a frequent guest in the national media. In fact, I heard him yesterday afternoon on NPR and said I hope he didn't miss his flight. John and I first met in 1995 when we were serving as advisors on a PBS miniseries with God on Our Side, The Rise of the Religious Right in America. And we've been fortunate to have him share his knowledge and insight with us before at the Baker Institute, and we're happy to have you back, John. As you can see from reading Michael Lindsay's biography, he was a member of the Sociology Department at Rice from 2006 to 2011, and also a Rice Scholar at the Baker Institute. As you can also see, he has done rather well. With the publication of his excellent book, Faith in the Halls of Power, Michael became one of the most widely quoted professors at Rice and was named, as your program notes, the most promising sociologist under 35 in the world by the World Congress of Sociology. And then this past fall, he left us to become president of Gordon College in Massachusetts, making him one of the youngest college presidents in the country. My great concern for you, Michael, is that I'm afraid you may be peaking way too early. I think it's more seemly to spread your accomplishments out over a longer period. That's certainly what I have tried to do. It's just a thought. I mean, burnout can be so sad. But that said, it's great to have you back if just for a day. Now, our third speaker in this session is Leonard Pitts, Jr. I expect most of you know Leonard Pitts' work and have no difficulty understanding why he won an impressive array of prizes for his columns and his other journalistic work, including the Pulitzer Prize. Rather frequently over the past few years, my wife Patricia and I have said to each other over the morning paper and breakfast, "Have you read Leonard Pitts this morning?" Wow, another good one. He is often passionate, but always fair. He stirs the passions of some of his readers, not only because they dislike what he says, but because they find it really difficult to refute. as most of you know, he'll be speaking this evening at Temple Emmanuel, just across the street from us at 1500 Sunset, where Sunset and Rice Boulevards meet. I plan to be there, and after hearing him this afternoon, I think you'll want to be there as well. So we're delighted to have you with us today, Mr. Pitts. And Paul Dwerka, who's going to serve as moderator, joined I should say, first of all, he's a lifelong Texan and also a Rice alum. He joined the staff of Texas Monthly 1 year after its founding 38 years ago, and that actually makes him the longest single-serving person in the history of that magazine, which I'm also happy to add, Rice University alums played a signal role. He graduated from Rice with a BA in history and then got his JD from the University of Texas School of Law. He's a member of the State Bar of Texas and spent 5 years as an attorney with the Texas legislature. And he teaches at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at UT Austin, and is also a frequent guest discussing politics on national news programs as MSNBC, Fox NBC, CNN. His Texas Monthly Burka blog is regarded as a must-read for people who want to stay up with politics, what's going on in politics in Texas. And it's occasionally really pretty interesting subject. So Paul will serve as moderator after the three speakers go. The microphones are here for you to just enjoy seeing. We are, because we feel that as much time as possible should be given to our experts. We're not going to have a Q&A session from the audience tonight, so this afternoon. So happy now to thank you again for coming, and happy to start with John Green.
Thank you very much, Bill, for that generous introduction. It's wonderful to be back in Texas and back at the Baker Institute. I think it was, about 10 years ago, we were here, a group of us talking about religion and politics, and one of the interesting things is how little has changed over that period of time. What I'd like to do today is just talk very briefly about the basic underlying relationships between religion and politics as we go into the 2012 presidential election. And I want to show you a couple of pictures. And the first picture will look a little complicated, and we'll spend a little bit of time on it. But then the subsequent pictures will be easier because they're basically the same picture with just a couple of exceptions. What we're going to look at first is the underlying baseline of the religious vote for president in 2012. And one of the most important things to realize is, and I'm sure this audience doesn't need to be reminded of this, is that religion plays a very important role in American politics. It is not always the most important factor in elections, but it never quite goes away. And sometimes it's extremely important, as we have witnessed in the recent early Republican nominating contests. But I expect that it will continue to play a role in 2012 as well. And one of the best ways to look at that is to look at the previous election, to look at the 2008 election and use that as a baseline for talking about what might happen this year. So there is our first picture. This is a bar chart that shows the vote for President Obama and the vote for John McCain, one, of course, in blue and the other in red. Some of you may remember when the colors were reversed, but then I'm dating myself. That was a little while ago. And the groups down the side are religious groups. There's 12 of them, and they're ordered from the highest Obama vote down to the highest McCain vote. And these are groups that we hear about a lot in political coverage. They're important political groups. If you look at sort of the top half of the chart, you'll see a number of groups that sociologists and historians often refer to as ethno-cultural or ethno-religious groups, the Black Protestant tradition. That second group of other faiths is actually a combination, composite group of basically non-Christians. That would be Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, and so forth. And There are, of course, differences between those groups, but for ease of presentation, I put them all together. Then we have the unaffiliated population, a rapidly growing population in the United States, people who are not involved in organized religion. That's an internally diverse group, but distinctive in politics. And then we have minority Catholics and Protestants. These are non-black but non-white. Protestants and Catholics, largely Hispanic these days, but there are a number of other groups there as well. Now, these kinds of groups, with the possible exception of the unaffiliated, have been very important in American politics for a long time. In fact, through most of our history, the impact of religion on the vote was through religious affiliation. Other measures of religion apparently didn't have nearly as much impact. But if you look towards the bottom of the chart, you'll see something that seems to be different, something that seems to be new over the last 30 or 40 years, and that is that it's not just affiliation that matters, but it's religiosity that matters. And the groups towards the bottom half are by and large, the large Christian communities, the white Roman Catholics, white mainline Protestants, white evangelical Protestants, but divided up between observant members. Those are people who tell us that they attend worship once a week or more often, and the less observant, people who tell us that they don't go that often. A little bit unclear who's telling the truth. A little bit of confusion sometimes with these things, but worship attendance is a very powerful marker of the different approaches to religion. People who at least claim to attend worship regularly are much more traditional in their religiosity, and those who go less often are less traditional. And it doesn't mean that they're not religious, they're just religious in a different way. This is a very powerful picture because it shows that not only does religious affiliation matter to the vote, but for some large Christian communities, the level of religiosity matters as well. And so you can see sort of towards the middle of the chart, less observant white Catholics, less observant white mainline Protestants, who were pretty evenly divided between the candidates in 2008. And then we get into the more observant groups and to evangelical Protestants who become much, much more Republican. The other Christians groups also a combination. What gives that its punch are the Latter-day Saints, a group that's very, very Republican. Now remember, the 2008 election was supposed to be about the economy. The 2008 election was supposed to be about change. But yet this is a very stable, persistent pattern, and these religious groups matter a great deal to the vote, even though the subject of the election was about the economy. Of course, religious communities have something to say about the economy, although we tend to more often directly associate them with cultural issues of one kind or another. If we were to do some statistical mumbo-jumbo with this number, with this picture, the picture would not fundamentally change. The impact of these religious groups would decline if we took into account income, gender, region, and so forth, but the basic pattern would remain. In fact, in 2008, there was only one demographic variable that predicted the vote more strongly than religion, and that was race. But as you all notice, race is built in to these measures of religion because ethnicity and race are very closely tied to religion in the United States. So this is the baseline that we bring into 2008, these strong differences based in part on religious affiliation and in part on religiosity. Now, as many of you know, this pattern has not always existed in the United States. This is a fairly stable contemporary pattern, but historically there were other patterns. And let's just take a step back in time and look at an example of that. This is what the numbers might have looked like in 1960. Back 52 years ago, an election where religion mattered a great deal, when the first Roman Catholic elected president, John F. Kennedy, won the White House. The groups down the side, the religious groups, are in the same order as they were in the previous picture. In fact, we'll look back and observe that. You can see it's the same order, but notice that the bars don't line up in any particular way. In fact, it looks kind of like a mess. Well, we could take this chart and reorganize it with the most Democratic group at the top and the most Republican group at the bottom, and what that would be Roman Catholics up towards the top and Protestants of various kinds, particularly mainline Protestants, down towards the bottom. And if you look carefully, you'll notice that religious attendance, religiosity, doesn't have a consistent impact. Regular Mass attending Catholics are actually less democratic than their less observant co-religionists. A little bit different pattern occurs with white Protestants. This was a different world than the world that we live in. Some things were similar, and we can actually see in this picture some of the contemporary patterns emerging. For instance, the strong democratic voting of black Protestants, many of whom couldn't vote in 1960 because of segregation, but also the emerging Republican alignment of white evangelicals, particularly observant white evangelicals. But if you were covering this story back in 1960 and looked at this picture, you would see something very different, a world that was much more about affiliation and much less about religiosity. Well, what caused this change from 2008 to from 1960 to 2008? Well, there are many, many things that changed over that 52-year period, but there were several important things. One was the rise of the new cultural issues. I probably should put new in quotes because they're the new cultural issues which are arising even as we speak. And of course, a lot of that had to do with abortion, gay rights, same-sex marriage, those types of issues. But of course, connected with those came certain social movements, most famously the religious right, but there were progressive movements as well right around those issues. And then, as many of you know, the United States has always been a very pluralistic, diverse community when it comes to religion, and if you think back to that picture of 1960, it certainly portrays a very diverse society in these terms. But we have continued to become diverse in new ways, and there's a new kind of pluralism that has helped make this difference. Now, I like to make this point because when you look back at the 2008 vote, it's easy to assume, or it's easy for some people to assume, that somewhere in the Holy Writ is written the partisanship of different religious groups. That apparently is not the case. Over time, depending on the issues, depending on the context, religious groups move across party lines and develop different kinds of alliances. There were, however, some changes between 2004 and 2008. The basic patterns remained, but there were some changes on the margins. And of course, 2004, 2008 were very close elections. It's very likely that 2012 will be a very close election, so the election is likely to be decided on the margins. And what this picture shows is the change in the Democratic presidential vote between 2004 and 2008. And you can see on the far, I guess it would be your right-hand side, the percentage gain among various religious groups. Overall, President Obama gained 5 percentage points over John Kerry, went from losing a close election to winning a close election. And you'll notice that some of the big gains were among groups that are strongly Democratic. Black Protestants, the unaffiliated minority Catholics, a huge gain among minority Protestants, which is interesting because George Bush actually won Hispanic Protestants in 2004. But look down towards the bottom, and you'll notice something interesting. President Obama was able to make some gains among certain aspects of the white evangelical community, particularly the less observant. It's an 8 percentage point gain, which is similar to the gain that he had, in magnitude to the gain he had among black Protestants, which for obvious reasons were very excited for voting for President Obama. A lot of that gain among white evangelical Protestants was among young and well-educated evangelicals. And one of the really interesting things about 2012 will be to see if the Democratic Party can maintain those gains and perhaps even expand them. So when we talk about change in elections, there's the long-term changes that go over generations, like the difference between 1960 and 2012 or 2008, but then there are the short-term gains from changes from one election to another. What our baseline statistics suggest is that this year, if we see changes, we'll see changes of this sort, small changes within that overall structure, within that overall picture. This connection of religion to politics is not just among voters, it's among party leaders. This is the same picture, but this is for delegates to the national Democratic and Republican conventions, the organizations that formally nominated Barack Obama and John McCain. Now, of course, that was all sort of settled in the primaries, but the delegates still meet and they still vote. And we did a survey of them and we asked them about their religion, and you see almost exactly the same pattern. Now, these party elites are not identical to their supporters in the mass public in terms of religion, but very, very similar. You see basically the same pattern. So these religious differences, these religious elements of a coalition are deeply embedded in party coalitions. They're found among voters, they're found among party leaders, and in fact, we could sit up here all day and look at other kinds of pictures. We could look at grassroots activists, we could look at campaign donors, we could look at political consultants, we could look at members of Congress, and we'd see the same picture over and over again with very modest changes. And one of the things that this means is that religious affiliation plus religiosity in some cases is very closely associated with partisanship. Many religious groups come to their partisanship because of a particular issue, but once they become partisans, then their partisanship affects their views on other issues. And you can see the very close congruence between the two lines there, the solid line, which is the vote for President Obama across these religious groups, and then the dotted line is their self-identified partisanship. Now, it's partly that partisanship predicts partisan votes, but it's also partly that religion leads people to be partisan in a particular way. So what we find is, when we look at a baseline for 2012, is that both of the major parties have important faith-based constituencies, but there are groups in the middle that are unaligned or weakly aligned with the two parties. These key religious constituencies, or the key religious constituencies, are deeply embedded in the party coalitions at the mass and elites level. And while this pattern is relatively new in historical terms, it's very stable. It hasn't changed very much over the last 10 years. It may not change very much for the next 10 years, but it may be that 60 years from now, we'll have a completely different pattern because different issues and different politics have arisen. Well, what could this all mean directly for 2012? Well, we have a couple interesting pictures. This is a trial heat where voters were asked if the election were held today between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, who would you vote for? And broken out by the same set of religious groups. Remarkably similar picture. Now, I don't know how valuable these numbers are. This survey was taken in November of 2011. And a lot has changed since November. Here we are in January. In just that short period of time, a lot has changed. If you look at the all voters bars right in the middle, it's very, very close. Within the margin of error of the survey, President Obama was slightly ahead. If this pattern were to emerge between President Obama and the Republican nominee, whoever that would be, we'd have a very, very close election. An election that would certainly look like 2004 and maybe even, dare I say it, like 2000. Very, very close election. And these faith-based differences would be a very important part, although, of course, obviously not the entire thing. If you think back to our very first picture, you'll notice that there's a little bit of discontinuity towards the bottom. Romney did very well among Mormons in our survey. Not quite as well with evangelicals, and interestingly enough, in this survey, even less well with mainline Protestants, white mainline Protestants, and Catholics. But so that's one kind of picture. I don't know how valid that would be, but it would turn out to be. But it gives you a sense of how these factors might play out between two real candidates. Here's the same trial heat for Obama versus Newt Gingrich, taken at the same time in November. In this trial heat, President Obama was a good bit ahead of Speaker Gingrich. In fact, if this were to be the pattern in November, this election would look a lot like 2008, a close but solid Democratic win. Who knows if that's what will ultimately turn out? Because Speaker Gingrich wasn't doing as well at that point in time, the bars tend to be lower, but notice that it's basically the same picture, So the campaigns and the candidates have only a little leeway when it comes to the faith-based vote. Now, that leeway can be the difference between winning and losing, right? It can be really critical. But these are the basic patterns that campaign managers and candidates and party leaders will be looking at. Well, I just thought I'd just end by making just a few comments about that alignment and how it might play out. Where could we see variations of that basic picture going into 2012? One possibility is that cultural issues, not the economy, but cultural issues may invigorate the Democratic vote, particularly among those ethno-religious groups, those religious, racial, and ethnic minorities that are so central to the Republican vote. And one might see some of our foreign policy issues like immigration, which are in a way cultural issues, that might play an important role there. It could very well be that the Occupy movement or other movements like that would help pull together Democratic religious groups. Remember, both of our major parties are coalitions of groups that don't necessarily get along with each other. They just get along less well with the people in the other party. So it may be able to pull these things together around a particular approach to social justice. And of course, depending on who the Republican nominee is, it could be that Democrats will have an opportunity to use economic policies and proposals to generate some additional votes among unaligned groups or groups that lean Republican, just like President Obama was able to do with white evangelicals in 2008. What about the Republicans? Well, if cultural issues can arouse the base of the Democratic Party, they can certainly arouse the base of the Republican Party, particularly among observant white Christians of one kind or another. And a lot of the debate that's going on in the Republican primaries is basically about this issue. How important and how effectively can the Republican nominee, whoever that may be, motivate these core Republican groups? It could also be that the Tea Party, which is best thought of in these terms as a reorganizing of the Republican coalition in a particular way. The Tea Party and the third generation of Christian right organizations, yes, we're on the third generation of Christian right. They've been around a long time. Well, those organizations haven't, but the movement's been around. Could also provide a forum for uniting the disparate Republican groups around a particular view of limited government. And of course, given the weak economy, there's also the possibility that the Republican nominee would be able to get some votes from Democratic-leaning groups based on the economy. So I think when we look into 2012, what we'll see is just a variation on the theme that we saw in 2008. But boy, the variation will be fun to watch. Thank you very much.
Well, it's great to be here with you all today, and I'm very excited to be able to share the platform with such distinguished folks whose work I've appreciated for many, many years. As Bill mentioned a few years ago, I wrote a book called Faith in the Halls of Power: How Evangelicals Joined the American Elite. It was actually my dissertation, and I'm living proof you can write a dissertation that your wife will describe as actually interesting. For that project, I interviewed 360 leaders in government, business, and nonprofit life about their religious makeup and how their religious commitments affected their public profiles, their public policies, their public stands, and their public leadership. And so this afternoon, what I'd like to do is just share with you some of the things that I walked into that particular project expecting and actually found not to be true, not to be the case. So I've listed them as 10 myths about religious conservatives and their profile among the American electorate. And by this, I'm really talking about evangelical Protestants and conservative Catholics, which is oftentimes referred to as a religious right. But actually, there's a wider variation within that. We can find lots of folks who were in this religious category who supported President Obama 4 years ago and may very well support him again in 2012. But what do we know about these folks, and what are some of the myths that I think a lot of people assume when they are studying it from a distance? Number one is that religious conservatism is primarily a political force. We get this expectation from the national media because evangelicals are discussed most frequently as it relates to presidential politics, when in fact what you find is that's not been the case historically, and I don't think it would be the case today. If you were to do a content analysis, for example, of the sermons in an average evangelical congregation over the course of a year, or even in the month leading up to an election, the likelihood that that political subjects would emerge as a important subtext in those congregations or in those sermons is actually not very likely at all. In fact, do you know what religious group you're more likely to hear political discourse in a sermon? Black Protestants. Much more common in the black church in support of Democratic candidates than in the evangelical church in support of Republican candidates. When we really began to see this shift actually occurred in the candidacy of one individual in 1988 when Pat Robertson ran for office. And the reason is because Pat Robertson built a very sophisticated network of supporters, especially in Iowa, but in other states as well. When his campaign folded, he didn't necessarily throw his weight behind who ended up getting the election, President Bush. Instead, he encouraged his enthusiasts, his supporters, to become active participants at the grassroots level in Republican politics. And so they became the foot soldiers of the Republican Party all over the country. And that changed the fabric of how we understood evangelicals and saw them as being much more involved in the political framework. But fundamentally, religious conservatism is not a political movement. Second big myth that many people assume is that theology drives the political agenda of these folks. You can get this, for example, if you observe pundits who are making observations about, let's say, President Bush's activity in the Middle East, whether it relate to Israel and Palestine or Iraq. Incidentally, I spent a lot of time trying to look to see who were the major players shaping the president's policy related to Iraq. And what I found is, while it's true, President George W. Bush had more evangelical advisors in his inner circle than any other president in modern history, the people who were making the strongest case for intervention in Iraq were actually not part of that evangelical crowd. They were actually the crowd comprised primarily of Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld, who are some of the most irreligious members of the political elites in President Bush's administration. Instead, it's not theology that drives much of their political ambitions among evangelicals and conservative Catholics. Instead, it's pragmatism. They recognize that they have a very significant seat at the table in the Republican Party. To this day, evangelicals remain the most organized constituency of the Republican Party, and so they have clout and weight, and they use it quite effectively, especially in certain states. And if you want to see an example of how that pragmatism has played out in the past and might actually affect this particular election, look no further than California and Proposition 8. Where Mormons and conservative Southern Baptists worked very closely together on a public policy issue. So a lot of the observations about will evangelicals support Mitt Romney if he gets the nomination, I say just look back 4 years ago, and I think you can see a very strong case of where that might occur. A third myth that a lot of folks have about evangelicals and politics is that when you're discussing it on a national landscape, you're primarily focusing on white suburbia and the flyover states. Well, it's true that those are important parts of the electoral map. But actually, I find the far more interesting story occurs among Latino and Asian congregations in swing states like Florida, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Because it's in those congregations where you find people who are more likely to show up to vote on election day than the average citizen. And oftentimes, they're very engaged by the religious narrative of the individual candidate. This is why candidates are so intentional about talking about their own religious heritage. This didn't happen 30, 40 years ago. It actually occurred when Jimmy Carter made an off-the-cuff remark about being born again. You may recall that. Then 3 weeks later, his opponent, Gerald Ford, announced that he too was born again. And ever since then, every political candidate has been talking about just how born again they are. So it's not primarily about flyover states that we'll be looking at in this particular election. I think it'll be looking much more significantly at those swing states, and particularly ethnic congregations where there's strong evangelical connection, but comes in surprising ways. Fourth, a myth that you might assume is that the home front is the main political stage. By this, you're expecting that it's about the domestic policy agenda, abortion, same-sex marriage, maybe even immigration. Those are certainly important issues that I think will emerge, continue to be galvanizing forces among the electorate, and certainly resonate for some people. But actually, when you analyze the religious influence of a particular presidency, if you look for the domestic agenda, you won't find much has happened at all. Instead, the far more interesting story is on foreign policy. For example, when I interviewed President Carter, I asked him about the salience of his faith. And my hunch was that he had a lot more latitude on foreign policy to bring his religious convictions into the conversation than he does on the domestic policy front. In part because most Americans don't care about foreign policy, so the national media doesn't report on it. And so administrations have a freer hand. They are able to reveal their ideological convictions on the foreign stage much more easily than they are on the domestic stage. President Carter said, well, probably I think where you would say it played the biggest difference in my life and in my administration relates to the Camp David Accords. Interesting side note about the Camp David Accords. When Menachem Begin, Anwar Sadat, and Jimmy Carter sat down at Camp David, do you know what the first thing was that they did at that gathering? It wasn't issue a press briefing or talking points. It wasn't a memorandum of understanding that would be guiding the discussions. The very first thing that these three men, a Jew, a Muslim, and a Christian did was issue a worldwide call to prayer. So the home front being the main political stage is just a myth. Foreign policy is where you ought to look. If you're trying to get a sense of where does a candidate's ideological convictions come into bear and have the most potential impact in their administration, look at their foreign policy positions. Fifth, most people assume that evangelicals and conservative Catholics have succeeded in politics because of their unity. This is one of the things that I expected when I started my research. What I found, however, is that there are very significant divides, ones that sometimes we gloss over, but they're very significant on particular policy issues. One of the most contentious issues that arose over the last 30 years is one that now we take for granted, but actually was a significant policy debate in the 1980s. I went to Dartmouth a number of years ago to interview Dr. C. Everett Koop. Dr. Koop was Surgeon General under President Reagan and was the darling of the evangelical community when he was named Surgeon General in 1981. In fact, the public health community, however, had a very different opinion of Dr. Koop, not because he was a bad man, but because he had no public health experience. He was a world-class pediatric surgeon at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. But Ronald Reagan liked C. Everett Koop in part because some of his evangelical friends said that Koop would be a good Surgeon General. And so it ended up being that Dr. Koop was confirmed and served for 5 years in which he really won the trust and the confidence of the public health community. Then in 1986, he had a fork in the road that he had to confront. And it was what would the U.S. government do in response to this disease that more people were talking about at that time that we now know as AIDS. As it turned out, Dr. Koop suggested that AIDS was a public health crisis, and as a result, it required the federal government's intervention and involvement. Now, that was a controversial decision to make generally, but in a Republican administration, in which your primary constituency that had brought you to the table for Dr. Koop were evangelicals, that was anathema. Because you see, evangelicals at that time did not see AIDS as a public health crisis. Instead, they saw it as a plague for sinful behavior. And the idea that the U.S. government would be involved in public policy to try and help people with AIDS was something very foreign to them. And so there emerged a very sharp and bitter debate, even within the White House, among evangelicals. Dr. Koop, for example, told me about a series of very tense conversations that he had with the domestic policy advisor of President Reagan. This would be the principal political officer who would be making recommendations to the president about what they ought to do. This person happened to be Gary Bauer. So what happened is that Dr. Koop would try and get an appointment with President Reagan to talk about what the government ought to do for the AIDS crisis, and Gary Bauer's office will get that appointment removed from the president's agenda. This happened time after time, and eventually it became a real rancorous debate within the White House. Most people from the outside would assume that all the evangelicals who are working in the same White House, that they huddle together and they have prayer and Bible study and sing Kumbaya. It just doesn't work that way. In fact, there are sharp political divisions. Sixth major myth that I found when I was studying how evangelicals joined the American elite was the assumption that the megachurch has been the source of their political influence over the years, when in fact, that's completely wrong. We hear a lot about the megachurch, but the idea that the megachurch is the mechanism by which evangelicals become politically active just doesn't even fit with the paradigm of what evangelicals expect when they go to church. Instead, the real source of mobilization has actually been a group of nonprofit organizations, 501c3s, that we oftentimes refer to as parachurch organizations. Parachurch organizations serve a variety of different functions, oftentimes inspired by religious convictions, but they don't have the same operating procedures as local houses of worship, and as a result, they don't have the same requirements that local houses of worship do. Now, in the tax rules requires that all 501c3s be nonpartisan, not involved in political positions. However, there are a whole range of parachurch organizations that have been politically active in one way or another. Focus on the Family is probably one of the most notable there. The parachurch is far more significant than the megachurch when you're looking at evangelical political influence. Seventh, most people assume that religious conservatives, by definition, are part of a conserving movement. I mean, you would expect, even the word there, conserving, conservatives, when in fact, most evangelicals do not see themselves in a conserving framework, but instead in a reforming framework. They see themselves as reformers. And this comes from a long heritage of Protestantism back to the time of Martin Luther. It's this notion that we ought to be engaged in the world because we can help set it aright. And so there is a impulse, a drive, and an energy that says we're going to try and make the world a better place, and we ought to do that through political reform. And that's why every pundit who suggests that evangelicalism was important to the last election, but they're not going to be important in this one, they're always disappointed. Because even when evangelicals lose elections, they're still staying engaged because they fundamentally see this as part of their responsibility in the world to try and reform society. 8, most people assume that evangelical leaders and preachers are close, when in fact, they are not. There are very sharp divisions that exist between evangelical politicians and preachers, and in fact, they oftentimes fight each other tooth and nail. One of the best interviews I had was with Dick Armey. Majority Leader Armey was from the state of Texas. He's an economist, was on the faculty of the University of North Texas, and he was no longer in politics at the time of the interview, which meant he gave me good material. And one of the things that Leader Armey talked to me about were a series of very difficult meetings that he had with a group of pastors, religious leaders that were spearheaded largely by James Dobson, a focus on the family. In the late 1990s, for example, when the Republicans were in the majority, many of these leaders would come to meet with Republican leadership and saying, you're not getting the agenda done that we wanted to have accomplished. We put you here and now you're not delivering. And there was one particularly tense moment in which Leader Armey turned to James Dobson and basically said, you don't know what you're doing. You've never been elected to public office. You don't understand the process of political compromise. And he had some choice words for Dr. Dobson, which were reported widely in the process. And in the end, it revealed this deep fracture that exists between some of these political leaders who are actually in elected office and some of their constituents, whom everybody assumes they're in lockstep, when in fact I found very deep tensions. The White House has an office known as the Office of Public Liaison, which is largely a group that tries to interact with different constituencies. Some presidents have been more effective at having a liaison to the religious community, especially in Republican administrations, that have made a positive difference. George W. Bush had a very, very effective liaison to the evangelical community, a man named Tim Gagline. And he did an effective job of building those kind of constituencies. President Bush, 41, did not have as good of a liaison, and that's where you begin to see some of these rifts come into public scene. The idea that evangelical leaders and evangelical preachers are close is patently false. Number 9, a myth that you might expect is that talk is cheap and evangelicals want results. You would think that that's what they're really pushing for. Actually, that's not the case. Evangelicals are more concerned with the symbolism that's shaped with public policy agenda because, frankly, they're like every other interest group. They recognize that in the end, when you're trying to identify how one particular interest group has achieved their objective through active public policy, you're not going to find a red thread all the way through. Instead, there's lots of compromise, there's lots of adjustments. Evangelicals appreciate the fact that voting is fundamentally about symbolic action. And therefore, they're concerned that they have a seat at the table and that their positions are respected. Now, obviously, they do want some public policy results. But after 30 years where abortion policy really has not changed fundamentally in the United States, I think most evangelical leaders recognize that there's not going to be a wholesale change just because they elect their particular person into office. Instead, they're interested in making sure that their voice is heard, and that on particular issues, there's an opportunity for one of their representatives to sit at the table, which is part of the reason why evangelicals were so excited when C. Everett Koop was named Surgeon General. It's the same phenomenon when Karen Hughes was named counselor to the president under President George W. Bush. Incidentally, I'll also mention it's why evangelicals were very excited when Francis Collins was named director of the National Institutes of Health by President Obama. Francis Collins is a well-known evangelical. He's written a book called The Language of God. And he's a world-class scientist, led the 5 research teams that mapped the human genome. But also it was a politically very smart move for President Obama because it was a way of signaling to the evangelical community that one of their own would be in a position of leadership. 10th and final myth that I encountered while I was working on faith in the halls of power comes from an editorial that appeared in the Washington Post in 1993 that was describing evangelicals. In the wake of Bill Clinton's victory, many people were saying that evangelicals had been a very important constituency for Ronald Reagan's election, but we had entered into a new time, a new era in which rational folks would see that evangelicals were not really important. And in fact, the writer described evangelicals as, quote, poor, uneducated, and easily led. Well, I can tell you, after studying them, they are certainly not poor. Among the people that I interviewed, I looked at the amount of philanthropic dollars that they contributed to different charities in a given year. On the low end, out of 360 people, there were folks who were giving about $10,000 a year away each year. On the high end, it was $15 million a year. The average amount of contributions coming out from evangelical business leaders I interviewed was $1.1 million. They were hardly poor. Uneducated, if you look at national standards, you can certainly see that evangelicals are on par with the rest of the population in terms of college-bound students as well as college graduates. And in fact, you can see that evangelicals hail from some of the most prestigious institutions in the country. I happen to lead a Christian liberal arts college called Gordon College in Massachusetts. But the real interesting story over the last 30 years is not how evangelicals have made such a significant difference through Christian schools, but instead how many evangelicals are graduating from the very top universities in the country. Many people wonder, why is it that there's so many more evangelicals that are graduating from places like Harvard, Yale, and Princeton? And I simply close with an interesting word picture for you. I looked at the photograph of the Campus Crusade for Christ chapter at Yale University in 1980. This is one of the evangelical ministries that has been active at different campuses. You look at that picture, it's 100% white. Look at that same campus chapter, a picture of them in 2005, and what you'll see is it's 90% non-white. As elite universities have drawn more students of racial and ethnic diversity and people from different parts of the country and around the world, they've also had an unintended consequence of creating religious diversity. And in the process, it's changing the makeup of evangelicals in the United States. 10 myths about evangelicals and the halls of power and the difference that they're making in American political life, historically and in 2012. Thank you very much.
Well, we've had the scholars. Now we get the pundit. Yeah, right. You haven't heard me. You haven't heard me yet. Before I start talking about the impact of religion in the election of 2012, I'd like to, if you would indulge me, spend just a couple of minutes talking about religion in our politics about 50 years ago. And you may think I'm thinking about or going to talk about John Kennedy and his requirement to make a speech that announced that though he was a Catholic, please don't be afraid, don't run for the exits, I'm not going to be taking orders from the Pope. And to a degree I am. But I'm also talking about something that is sort of less thought about when we discuss religion and its impact upon our politics. Last year, I was honored, and I don't use that word lightly, but I was honored to meet a man named James Zwerg, and I doubt most of you know who James Zwerg is. At this point, he's in his early 70s, and he is a retired minister, Christian minister. When he entered the news briefly in 1961, he was a 21-year-old theology student. He was from Wisconsin and was an exchange student and had gone down to Fisk as an exchange student, Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. And there he became involved in something called the Freedom Rides. The Freedom Rides, for those of you who are too young or otherwise unfamiliar, were undertaken by college students in the spring of 1961 as a demonstration against segregated seating on interstate buses, particularly in the South. This seating was illegal. The Supreme Court had already weighed in, but the South had simply chosen to ignore the ruling of the Supreme Court. So you had these college kids who decided that they were going to spend the spring of 1961, these mostly Christian and nonviolent college students who decided they were going to spend the spring of 1961 traveling into the South to make a point of the South's intransigence and to make the point that they had the right to sit together on interstate buses. James Zwerg was in the second wave of Freedom Riders. They arrived in Montgomery, Alabama on Mother's Day of 1961. And as he told me the story, there was an eerie quiet when they reached the station. And then there was this news photographer, standing there waiting on the bus to arrive. Out of nowhere, this heavy-set gentleman with a cigar, white guy, comes and grabs the cameraman, throws him down, stomps and breaks his camera. And that seemed to be the signal, he said. And mob of 3,000 people materialized, and pretty much all hell broke loose. There's only one known picture of this riot because the Klansmen and the others in the mob attacked everybody that they saw with a camera. So there's literally only one picture. But James worked, as he described it to me, his particular experience in this. He was coming off the bus. He was snatched. Someone said, "Get the nigger lover." He was thrown over the railing. His back was stomped, and he says, as he put it, that's when I think I broke my vertebrae. And he says the last thing he remembered was a foot coming down into his face. And I should have led all of this. The first thing he did was not to come out off the bus. The first thing he did was to pray. And then he came off the bus and he was attacked. And he said the last thing he remembered was the foot coming down into his face. There's a famous picture of him that was taken that you'll find in almost any book on the civil rights movement. The CNN says he looks like a bloody scarecrow. He's this white guy leaning against a wall, I guess it is, blood streaming down his face, checking his teeth because his teeth were shattered by the boot in the face. There's also a video of him in which he says, and I asked him about this video, he says he doesn't even remember making it. He was semi-conscious on his hospital bed. But he says in the video that we're gonna do this and we're gonna keep coming, and we'll accept the beatings, we'll accept the brutality, and we'll even accept death because we know that we're doing what is right. As I said, I was honored to meet Mr. Zwerg in Montgomery, as a matter of fact, last year for a 50th anniversary commemoration of the Freedom Rides, and he was speaking about why he chose to do what he did. And you have to understand he still bears the scars from this. He can hardly get around because the vertebrae of his back, the injury still bothers him. His teeth, he says, his teeth don't fall out as might be normal with old age. His teeth tend to, occasionally he'll just have a tooth crack and crumble to pieces because of, getting stomped in the face. And yet he said he was never so alive as he was in that moment in 1961. He was never so alive in his faith, he says, as he was in that moment in 1961. To him that was, and to me that was, the ultimate act of his faith. I mentioned the election of 1961 in order to provide some this moment of politics and faith in 1961 in order to provide some context for when we talk about politics and faith in 2012. If patterns hold true, this Christmas we will hear again that there's a war on Christmas, and God save us all. In this election, in the primary season, we're already seeing things that we have seen before. The politicians seem to be elbowing one another out of the way to be able to declare who is the most born again. I think the phrase was that that you were saying, and they've all become very fluent in the language of faith. Indeed, obviously fluent in a way that never would have been considered possible or necessary, for that matter, in the days when John F. Kennedy was president. You've got Governor Rick Perry, who, as I understand, held a prayer meeting shortly before he went to Iowa to ascend to the mantle. You've got Michelle Bachmann. One of the controversies about her was her husband's supposed religious cures for homosexuality. You've got Mr. Gingrich declaring that he has been forgiven by God for his serial marriages. And you've got Mr. Romney in sort of a bad mirror inversion of John Kennedy 50 years ago, being forced to deal with people who feel as if he cannot be president because he is a member of the Mormon faith. But every candidate has, this is not something that a candidate can sort of slide by anymore, something that a candidate can call personal business. This is something that every candidate must locate himself in relationship to for the benefit of those that he or she is seeking votes from. And it often seems, at least to me, that faith in these days is used as a way to locate, for the candidate again, to locate him or herself on the American spectrum, as a way of assuring, as a coding for normality, and as a coding for racial and cultural commonalities. It was interesting to me in the election of 2008 that President Obama's religious bona fides were repeatedly rejected, and that there was a lot of talk about this Jeremiah Wright this Jeremiah Wright doesn't preach any kind of gospel that I know. That's what you heard from a lot of folks. And I think that what you heard there, let me back up. Obviously, Jeremiah Wright stuck his foot in his mouth more than one time. And seemed almost up to the shin bone at some points. So don't take this as a defense of Reverend Wright. I wrote a column criticizing him and comparing him at one point to Jimmy Walker from Good Times, and suggesting that the only thing missing was to slap a salute and say dynamite. So don't take this the wrong way. But what I saw in a lot of my readership was beyond criticism and anger with Jeremiah Wright, criticism and anger at the idea of a Jeremiah Wright, at the idea of a minister of a preacher who preached, as they call it, liberation theology, as the idea of a preacher who preached that things are unequal for you here and now, and that we need to do something about this here and now, which is, coincidentally enough, the gospel that was preached by another prominent religious political figure from the 1960s named Martin Luther King Jr. But it has become a thing of controversy now, and it has become a thing where in 2008, the candidate for presidency of the United States is forced to sort of condemn and sort of step back from not just, again, the idea of Jeremiah Wright, but I think a lot of people, not just Jeremiah Wright, but again, in a lot of people's minds, I think the very idea of a Jeremiah Wright. I watched that, and it struck me that we go to our religious houses for the things that we need, and if everything here on earth is more or less good for you, if you've got your health care check, and you've got your job check, and you've got your income, and the kids are doing okay in college, it's assured, and you live in a pretty decent neighborhood, then you go to a preacher who helps to prepare you for heaven and the sweet by and by. If you live on the south side of Chicago, if you live in South Central Los Angeles, if you live in Liberty City in Miami, if you live in Southeast in Washington, D.C., if you live in Harlem, New York, if you live in some of these other places where African Americans are forced to make their homes, and if you deal with the things that they are forced to deal with, then perhaps you want a minister whose focus, not denigrating the sweet by and by, but who is also focused on helping you to get over and to navigate the tough here and now. And I think the inability of people to grasp that, again, not just Jeremiah Wright, but the very idea of a Jeremiah Wright, I think the inability of people to grasp that speaks volumes to the distance between us as a nation racially, and also I think volumes to how far we have come and the ways in which our opinion, our view of faith has changed since James Werg made his courageous stand. I wrote a column a few years ago in which I asked whatever happened to the political left, because we've heard for 30 years about the agenda and the myths and the realities of the political right. We've heard almost nothing about the political left, or the religious left, since probably the time of Dr. King's assassination. And I think that as we look at where faith stands in the election of 2012, as we look at politicians who have learned to, I don't want to be partisan here, let's say, as we look at politicians who have learned to speak fluently, and both, politicians of both parties, frankly, who have learned to speak fluently the language of faith, but not necessarily back it up with any actions. As we look at politicians who have learned to look like what it is that they're supposed to be, but not necessarily live like what it is they're supposed to be. I think that the next great movement, maybe this year, maybe in the next political cycle, I don't know, but I think the next great movement has to be someone who is willing to, or some movement that is willing to pick up the mantle that was dropped by the James Wergs and the Jim Reeves and the Fred Shuttlesworths and the Dr. Kings and the people known and unknown of the 1960s, who frankly felt that faith was not this thing that would be used to cudgel other people. Faith was not this thing that would be used to separate out. Faith was not this thing that empowered me to beat you upside the head. Faith was this thing that obligated me to be in the business of seeing to your well-being, to what was good for you. That to me is where we haven't come in 2012. There is a thinness and a shrillness and a temporal nature to discussions of faith in 2012. There is a pettiness to discussions of faith in 2012. It often seems to be a lot of sound and fury, but is really about nothing. Do I need to know that Newt Gingrich was forgiven? Am I really in umbrage because the counter person at Target greets me with Happy Holidays as opposed to Merry Christmas? Is this really something over which I need to shriek and cry and raise heck, while I know that there are people who are hungry on the streets, of this city, while I know that there is injustice on this, in this nation, while I know that girls are being sold into sex slavery in Asia, while I know that women are being, beaten and abused, while I know that 1 in 6 women can at some point in her lifetime expect to be the victim of a rape or an attempted rape, while I know these things, is the war on Christmas really where I want to expend, my faith/political capital? I guess the point that I'd like to make, and I'll leave it with this, is that we seem to be in a time where faith is ever more prevalent in our political dialogue, and yet at the same time seems curiously shrunken, curiously smaller than it was in the days when James Reeb was bashed in his head and lost teeth and had his back broken and thought that this was the most wonderful thing that he had ever done.
We have about 20 minutes until we break up and go to our discussion groups. And I thought we might take a few minutes at that time to have a discussion among you all. One of the things that those of us who write about politics see is the tension that has existed really on the right side of the political spectrum, but between the social conservatives and the Tea Party. And to what extent are they the same? I know that there does seem to be a very strong effort, certainly in Texas, for the social conservatives in the legislature to try to bring the Tea Party types over into an alliance. Do you all see that as something that can work? How different are they? And I assume the same thing's going on nationally. So what do you see as the future of evangelicals and bringing in the Tea Party into their movement?
Well, the Tea Party organizations have lots of evangelicals in them. There's a considerable overlap between social conservatives and economic conservatives. And I need to speak up a little louder? Yeah. There's a, does that need better? There's a lot of overlap between social conservatives and economic conservatives in the Tea Party organizations. And oftentimes when this is discussed and written about, a contrast is drawn between the most libertarian elements of the Tea Party, which actually exist, they're really there, and the sort of social conservatives who are moonlighting in the Tea Party because they don't have anything else to do. But in fact, and those tensions, those differences certainly exist, but the great bulk of Tea Party activists are characterized by this overlap between social conservatives and economic conservatives. And I think that, as I mentioned just very briefly, I think the Tea Party organizations are a reorganization of the Republican coalition around the idea of limited government, and or a particular idea of limited government. And that's something that tends to unite Republicans. You know, it may very well be that libertarians and hardcore social conservatives can't agree on some things, but they can agree on the idea of limiting the size and scope of government. But those people in the middle who are both social conservatives and economic conservatives find it much easier to cooperate with one another. Now, I've interviewed a lot of local Tea Party activists, and they often arrive at the same point for very different reasons. For instance, there are some Tea Party activists that I've interviewed in Ohio that don't like the new national health care law because they see it as the first step towards socialism. But I've interviewed other Tea Party operatives who say that this just looks like one giant attempt at social engineering. And to their mind comes all the social policies that they disagree with or disagreed with over the last 30 or 40 years. So I think there's a real potential for these the social conservatives and the economic conservatives to come together because they can't agree, perhaps for different reasons, that the government should be smaller and not get any bigger. So I think there's maybe a little bit less tension there in operational terms than might at first appear.
Is the term democratic evangelicals obsolete? Is it alive and well? What's the situation there?
It's certainly alive and well, and I think that a candidate such as President Obama has a way of galvanizing that particular segment of the party because there is a sense in which, unlike, say, Senator Kerry, President Obama is able to speak the language of evangelicals in a way that they recognize. The language, the vernacular, it seems more natural. That's what really gets a candidate in trouble, is when they try to use religious language and you can tell it's like they are picking it up as a third language. That's when they really get into trouble. You know, it's when John McCain is embracing John Hagee as the great evangelical movement leader, when in fact, even within conservative evangelicals, there are lots of folks who don't embrace John Hagee. And so you can tell who knows the important players and who can speak authentically about that, and President Obama can.
I would agree that that President Obama speaks authentically more so than a lot of his than say Mr. McCain. I'm sorry. I would say that I'm sorry. I lost my train of thought. Okay. I keep hearing a telephone from over there. I would agree that President Obama speaks more authentically. I think in terms of your original question was whether the Democratic evangelical. I think that's the great unanswered question, that they are there, but that I think that the evangelical movement, by and large, or maybe the religious movement by and large, has been ill served by people in my profession, which is the media. I think a lot of those myths that you were talking about, we wrote them. We created them. So I think that there is a perception in this country that faith exists only to the limits of that white evangelical movement, and that I think is part of the reason why when a Jeremiah Wright or somebody else appears, they're a shock to the body politic, because we didn't know they were out there. We didn't see them on CBS. We didn't see them. Now, part of the reason also might be that those folks have not coalesced and have not designed or the organizations that the white evangelicals have to sort of coalesce around political issues and have an impact on elections. But I think a good part of the reason is also, frankly, that we in the media have not sought them out. We did not know they were there, and to a large degree still don't.
Mm-hmm. When you all talk to evangelical leaders, we had a governor who ran as a ally of evangelicals, and how do they react to politicians who, for want of a better term, wear their faith on their sleeve? Do they notice? Do they? How have you talked to people who have had to deal with that?
Yeah. It's a great question, Paul. I had a reporter one time call me and say, don't these evangelical leaders know that they're being used by these candidates? And I said, absolutely, and they're using them back. I mean, it's a two-way street, right? Jerry Falwell tells the story about how he never realized that he had real influence until President Reagan called him in 1982 when it was over a Supreme Court nominee. Evangelical movement leaders have not been used to being courted by political leaders, but they enjoy that access to power, and they actually use that access to power to get different things that they want accomplished. So, a lot of my colleagues in the academy will sometimes say, these folks are being duped. They don't even realize it. And I said, they're far smarter than you think. They fully recognize the way in which politics works is that I use the access that you provide for me, and in turn, I'll provide some access to you. So I think that they're keenly aware of how their language can be used and how their endorsements can be used. Now, that said, I do think, for example, many of the political leaders who seek the endorsements of different religious leaders, oftentimes the religious leaders do not realize the media onslaught that they will face once that endorsement comes. I think, for example, the pastor of First Baptist Church of Dallas, when he endorsed Governor Perry, I honestly think he had no idea how much of a mobilizing force that would be for folks. And in some ways, I think that it becomes a hard lesson in just how much presidential politics is like the NFL. It's a full contact sport.
Super Bowl.
It's the Super Bowl, isn't it? And if you are not used to dealing with politics at the highest of levels, you'll be surprised at how difficult it can be.
Well, I think it's presidential politics, not only the Super Bowl, but it's kind of a Super Bowl combination reality show. And many people and religious people who are involved in politics on the right and on the left have a pretty clear, it's been in my experience, have a pretty clear-eyed idea about the limitations of politics. And privately, and I don't know, you probably encountered this in your interviews, Michael, but privately, they understand the limits of politics very well. And they frequently have internal debates amongst themselves. You know, are we willing to compromise on this issue because maybe we'll achieve something important? Or is this the point where we have to really stand on our principles? And as one pastor once said to me, pick up our Bibles and go home. You know, if people aren't, if the politicians aren't going to work with us. So they're not, in my experience, not quite as naive as they're sometimes portrayed to be, but also there's a considerable amount of angst. You know, like you put it very well, Michael, that we're using these folks, but they're using us, and the using of people is not something that fits very comfortably with a lot of religious traditions.
I'm glad to hear you both say that, because I'm one of those journalists who has wondered, at something that seems so obvious to me, do they not get it? So I guess we're talking about chess in multiple dimensions being played here. Yeah.
Well, I wonder too, is there, it seems like idealism has almost left American politics.
What is this odd word you use? Can you define this term and use it in a sentence, please?
And I think that what people of my generation saw was a string of events that you could say started with the Kennedy assassination, Vietnam, the King assassination, the Bobby Kennedy assassination, all these terrible shocks, Watergate, and if it just didn't wring all the idealism out of that generation, you probably run into more. We don't have a lot of idealism in Texas. You may run into it more often than I do.
No, I think you're exactly right. I think part of the problem in the body politic, and part of the problem in my industry, frankly, is that we've gone to the opposite extreme from where we were, say, before those shocks that you mentioned. Before those years, we were credulous and a little bit naive and gullible and believed everything. Now we believe nothing. And I think that makes it exceptionally difficult. I think you have to be a masochist, frankly, to run for office. I think there's a certain amount of masochism involved in running for office, and I think it makes it probably nearly impossible to govern, because there is no leeway, there is no benefit of the doubt, there is no, all of those things are gone. I think that, and you see sort of echoes of this in sort of a silly way, but kind of a telling way, that every scandal since 1974 has the suffix "gate," as if everything were Watergate. Okay, and I think in part that's every journalist in his secret heart of hearts or her secret heart of hearts wants to be Woodward and/or Bernstein. So we're always hoping that we'll get the call and we'll pull on this thread and it'll unravel and it'll be this great Pulitzer Prize-winning career-making story. But I think part of it also is this idea that they're all corrupt, that it's all dirty and there's always something going on. And I think I tend to believe, and maybe this is me being gullible, but I tend to believe that a lot of people get into public service on both left or right for the right reasons. Now those right reasons may be beaten down or beaten out of them or otherwise scarred or whatever over the years, but I think that a lot of people get into this business of public service out of reasons of idealism. And I think that there's this process that happens when your idealism is returned constantly with cynicism, and when everything that you do or try to do is regarded as prelude to a scandal, that it becomes easier to do nothing. And and I don't have studies obviously to quantify that, but that's my gut feeling, that we have swung the pendulum so far the other way that it becomes nearly impossible for anybody to do anything. I wrote a column that will appear Sunday about gun control, and don't kill me. I'm in Texas. I know. I understand where I am. Okay. But if nobody's armed out there, please. But
If it will
you know,
comfort you,
yeah.
Rice has, being a private school, has an exception to the campus carry rule.
Cool. I just want to say, I wrote a piece on gun control, and which I happen to favor. But the thing that I wrote in the column that I wrote what to me were some pretty common sense, things that ought to be done. But at the end of the column, I was forced to say none of this will happen because people on the left will always will always choose to paint even responsible gun owners as lunatics and criminals, and people on the right will choose to see any proposition of a law as prelude to the black helicopters and the confiscation. And that sort of, and what that means is there can be absolutely no dialogue. You can't talk because there's no. If we trust each other, if I trust not in your basic goodwill, whatever the subject is that we're going to discuss, we can at least just talk about it. We may not even agree, but we can at least have a discussion about it based on that goodwill. But if I think you're a sleazy so-and-so who's out to con me, then why should I sit down and talk to you? And I think that's where we've sort of come in American politics.
I just want to make one real brief comment on idealism. I think it's alive and well, and I notice it among younger religious activists, some of them on the progressive side, some of them on the more conservative side. But one of the really interesting ways that idealism is expressed is a real revulsion against the political process. Many of them want to do it a different way. Their goals have not changed very much. In fact, in some ways, they're more idealistic than when I was that age. But they're profoundly distrustful of the process. So they want to do it a different way. Now, I don't think they know yet what that different way is. But a lot of their idealism comes out in a search for another way to achieve these purposes.
Not to disagree with you, but as you spoke, what I was hearing was there are idealists who are cynical about the process, which is kind of telling, I think.
Well, we have come to that point where we need to break up so that you all can go to your smaller groups, your breakout sessions. Thank you all for braving the rain and being here. Thanks to the panel, you all were great. Thank you. Thanks to the Texas Freedom Network for sponsoring this and for my alma mater for doing the same. And it's a great thing for me to be back at Rice today. Thank you all.
I don't know about you. I'm not disappointed with this today. I thought they did a pretty good job. Before saying a word about the breakout session, when you're talking about people using each other, I've spoken on several panels or programs where we're talking about Jewish, Christian, and Islamic fundamentalism. And one in Philadelphia, a Jewish scholar was asked, don't you realize that evangelical Christians, their strong support of Israel, that this scenario, this theology, if it works out, it means that more Jews will be killed ultimately than were in the Holocaust. And he said, we take our chances. All right, now I want to introduce you very briefly for previews of coming attractions, for teaser statements from our breakout session leaders, to tell you just a little bit about what they want to do. And I guess you all can come up here. First of all is Professor Muqtadar Khan, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Delaware. He's the founding director of the Islamic Studies program there. He's, in addition to a distinguished publishing record, he's a delightful man who talks knowledgeably about an increasingly important and sophisticated political subculture. Before asking for a précis of his session, I'd like to note that he has a new distinction. His 12-year-old son became the youngest person ever to create an iPhone app that is available on the Apple App Store.
Thank you, Bill, very much. First, I wanted to congratulate. This was one of the best seminars I have attended in a long time on religion and politics, and it was very informative. I will be doing my session here immediately after this. It's about Islamophobia and American presidential elections. I hope to achieve three things during the discussions. In the first thing that I would like to achieve is to talk about how Islam has become an issue. I mean, I couldn't believe it. Brother Hussein is president, and what's the point of having a Muslim president while Muslims are having such a tough time? This should be a warning to Mormons who are supporting and spending money. So the first point that I would like to talk about is how Islam has become an issue in elections in the United States. In fact, it is like a default strategy for Republicans, especially since 2010. If you don't have any ideas on what to do, let's just bash Islam, and we'll get money or votes. The second thing that I want to talk about is how American Muslims are engaging politics in the United States, how they evolved from voting for George Bush in 2000 to voting for Obama in 2008. And the third one, I forgot. We'll talk about it later.
Well, welcome to Texas. and it's all of us, I think, feel much more calm now that our governor has returned and we're not stumbling around leaderless. Now, in the other section, which will be meeting immediately after this, we'll be in the International Conference Facility right behind us, a very comfortable room as well. And this will be led by Professor Elaine Eklund, Associate Professor of Sociology and a Baker Institute Scholar, as I mentioned earlier. So happy to have her come and tell us about what you'll be discussing.
Bill, I want to thank you, too, for allowing the Religion and Public Life program to be a co-sponsor of this event. This has just been a wonderful event, and this is going to be a hard act to follow, but I feel like we're in a little competition here for who will attend our sessions, so I hope you'll attend mine. Immigrants and their children are quickly becoming 25% of the U.S. population, and as some of our panelists wisely pointed out, with them they're literally changing the face of American Christianity and increasing rapidly the diversity of religion in American society. And as we know, religion has a great impact on politics. So we can expect that in this election, as in elections past, people will be courting the Latino vote, and that the Latino Catholic vote will be an important part of that, as will the Asian American Protestant vote, the Muslim vote, and other pieces of the immigrant vote. So we'll have a rousing conversation about those kind of issues directly after this, where I'll present some research that I've done with a colleague, Michael Emerson, in the sociology department, as well as some of my own previous research on Asian American religion and politics. So I hope you'll join us, although I'm also supportive, of course, of the other sessions.
Let me give some good news about that. While it is still, and we're going to have a physics professor next, and he may say something different, but I think it's still hard to be in two places at once. But we are videotaping both sessions, and this time and the next time. So if you attend, whichever one you attend, and you want to go to the other one as well, within a few days, you can check Baker Institute website and videos and archives, and you will be able to see all of the entire session. So we want to make sure that that's available, and that will be very important also for twice as many people who were coming today had it not been for the threat of floods. So we're happy that that's going to be the case too. In the second sessions, here in the Commons room, and Anna has not gotten here yet, right? Okay. Dr. Anna Greenberg is going to be leading a session on the older or the traditional culture war issues. She's taught at the Kennedy School at Harvard. She's been a visiting a scholar at the Pew Center for People in the Press, and she is an extremely accomplished pollster and analyst, and also works with a polling and campaign consulting firm, Greenberg, Quinlan, Rossner. Her clients include Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords, Emily's List, Women's Voices, Women Vote, and NARAL, the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws. She's very well competent to talk about these particular issues, and assuming that she gets here, that her plane lands and she gets here fully, that will be in the second breakout session. And leading in the International Conference facility after that, or during that period, will be Professor Neil Lane. Dr. Lane, Senior Fellow in Science and Technology at the Baker Institute. He's the Malcolm Gillis University Professor and also Professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy. Dr. Lane's other notable positions include having served as Provost here at Rice, Director of the National Science Foundation, and Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy during the Clinton administration. So, Neil, if you would tell us about what you'd like to discuss.
Thank you very much, Bill. I've greatly enjoyed the panel discussion as well. Well, we're just going to talk about physics. I've had this physics talk that I wanted to give for a very long time, and so now our charge is to have a discussion about some of the issues at the interface of science and religion and politics. Normally, science is not thought of as a partisan issue, and then for the most part, it really isn't. But we can talk about some issues that might arise, such things as teaching evolution in schools, support of research and therapy involving stem cells, vaccination of girls against cervical cancer, such important issues as that, abstinence-only programs, and social science research of many kinds, because there are lots of pushback on the social sciences. We physicists appreciate them, but they're often unfairly criticized for their findings. We'll talk a little bit about strategies that have long been used, been quite effective, anti-science strategies, because by and large American people like science and trust scientists. So the strategy, if you don't like what they're talking about, is to make people question the science and bring along some so-called scientists, trot them out to say falsehoods. So on that regard, it's worked with evolution in some states, in some areas, and it continues to be an issue. It certainly was a strategy used effectively against banning smoking. Over time, that got corrected, against making regulations to control acid rain, the ozone hole, and now, of course, climate change. And there are some parallels, really, I will talk about between the climate change issue and evolution and some of the others. So we really look forward to having you. If you're not able to come to our session, I'm very pleased to hear that you'll be able to see us on TV, but we're going to serve free beer, so you'll miss that.
Thank you, Neil. I'm thinking of the techniques that can be used. Several years ago, they ran for a very brief period of time, and I can understand why it was brief, a Jack in the Box commercial in which a white jacketed person was talking about how the Jack in the Box big hamburger would lower your cholesterol, would bring down your blood pressure and things like that. And someone asked Jack, says, "Where'd you get that guy?" He says, "Tobacco company." So it did. Well, I'm having a wonderful time. I think this is a great day already, and we're just half through. Let me tell you about another great day coming. That's a nice religious. On March 8th and 9th, in my other life here at the Baker Institute, I also direct the drug policy program. And we have, drug policy is growing increasingly important. We have a terrific program coming up on March 8th and 9th. On March 8th, Rick Steves, the travel writer, is going to talk about what his travels have taught him about the way drug policy can operate more effectively, less harmfully in other countries. Then the next day, in what is actually quite rare, we have some of the strongest opponents, both of drug policy reform and of prohibition, head-to-head, going all day long. It's going to be really, really exciting. And in the middle, we have a We weren't able to get her because of her schedule to come directly, but Michelle Alexander, who's the author of the new book, or the relatively new book and very important book, The New Jim Crow, Over-Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, which Leonard Pitts has just within the last few days offered a raffle for people to get copies of that book, because it is such an important book. There's going to be a section on that. We'll talk about international initiatives and different policies, a program dedicated just to whether we should or should not legalize marijuana, and a law enforcement panel with District Attorney Pat Lykos, Assistant Chief Michael Durden, Judge Michael McSpadden, and a member of a group, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. So it's going to be a really exciting day, and I hope we'll be sending out save the date days soon, but put down March 8th and March 9th for that. We will not have a concluding valedictory at the end of the two sessions, but we'll have about, I think it will take about 5 or 10 minutes. It's not too far here. Restrooms for men are over here, for women over here, and then we'll start up pretty soon. We'll have a break after that, come back to whichever one you want to, or stay whichever way you want to do, and then when that second session is over, you can just go home. But thank you so much for coming, and we'll hope you'll come back to our other events.
Thank you.